deep need. Today on the podcast is the first episode of Season 2, and I'm really excited to get to talk to Randy Hardman, Asbury Seminary alum and owner of Drinklings Coffee Shop in Wilmore. In this episode, we talk about all the things, the intersection of faith, mission, and business, how Drinklings got started, and how they are using their place in the community to do good. Let's listen. So, when did you start Drinklings?
So we started in October of 2016,
Okay.
and we actually started just as a mug company. I mean, the concept, we did proof of concept, all that kind of stuff, starting in February of 2016. In fact, I remember the day that I a couple months earlier, it was just it was a weird, I was at home over Christmas, and I was trying to kind of figure out, where, what to be doing with my life, stuff like that. I had gone through seminary and was kind of just in this weird, post-seminary place that a lot of people wind themselves up in, strangely enough.
Yeah, where did you do seminary?
At Asbury Theological Seminary. And, the PhD route just it wasn't going to unpack itself for at least a while. And so I was just trying to figure out what directions to take. And strangely enough, I just kind of had this idea of mugs, the word mugs just kind of came upon me. And, my dad was always a collector of mugs. I kind of adopted that. And so if you would open up my kitchen cabinet, you would see 30 mugs, they'd fall out and stuff like that. And so somewhere along the line, it was I wonder if we could do this. I wonder if I could make some mugs and just, even just as a side little hobby or whatever. So I started looking into that, what it would take to actually do that kind of stuff. Now I'm not an artist by any means, and I tried to do that kind of stuff, and it would be funny to look back at some of the first mugs that we kind of prototyped because they're so bad. I mean, I'm not a graphic designer. I didn't know Adobe Illustrator or anything like that. I didn't know the machinery that we were using. So it was a lot of startups where if you went back to the original startup, you would look at it and be it's going to be a complete failure.
That's
right?
how all of us have done everything.
Yeah. I mean, it's like going back and reading your first seminary paper, and you're they should have failed me and kicked me out of school.
But thank God that they did not.
So we that started in December, February. It was okay, this is something that's going to happen, and so I threw out on social media, interested in starting a coffee mug company. What should we call it? And we had two or three different people just say Drinklings. We had about 15 different ideas, but Drinklings became the thing, right? And I think I might have even said something about C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, kind of there's an influence there. And of course, Drinklings, you can always tell who knows it and who doesn't know it. People will come in and they'll what does this mean? And other people are this is Tolkien and this is C.S. Lewis, right?
Right.
And that became just kind of it was an immediate this is what we do.
Yeah.
So
For those who don't know Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, tell us the connection between Drinklings and them.
Yeah, so C.S. Lewis and Tolkien were part of this little writers group over at Oxford called the Inklings. I guess Oxford, Cambridge, but the eagle and the child there. And I think that Lewis in particular, but also Tolkien, just became so influential in my own spiritual growth, my own understandings of Christianity, a lot of existential growth and stuff like that. Tolkien, especially on the latter, a lot of existential, how to kind of make sense out of life and so forth. But I think the really awesome thing was they took something just as basic as literature, and they changed the world with it.
Yes.
And I think they would be surprised looking back at how different the world probably is with their stuff versus potentially without it.
Yeah.
Right. So they made a major social contribution. They did it out of creativity. They did it out of faith, out of their convictions. And they changed the world. So for us, we're not a literature society. We do have a Tolkien and Lewis writing group that meets, and we do reading papers. It's an old-fashioned kind of Inklings thing. But our hope was saying we're going to take something as basic as coffee and do something with it culturally, socially that means something.
Yeah.
And so there's no direct correlation really outside of the name and the fact that we love them and we put their faces on some mugs. But it's just kind of like a homage throwback to like they changed the world, you know, and so that's kind of what that is.
I love that.
So, but all I was going to say is like we started off as a mug company in October, and then by December we thought it makes sense to be, if we're going to make coffee mugs, to potentially think about making coffee to go in the mugs.
For sure.
And so we started doing that. And so, you know, that's kind of grown over the time.
And our podcast guests, as you know, get free bags of coffee as a gift for being on the podcast that you make. So I've heard nothing but good.
Yeah, that's good. Do I get a bag of?
Yes, you do. I was like, I don't know if you want it because I feel like you get all the free coffee you want. But yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you said that you were thinking about what to do after seminary, and the word mugs just kind of came to your mind. Is that how God normally speaks to you, like with just like words?
Oh no, I'm one of those people that is cautiously optimistic about the way that God speaks to it. In fact, when I came to seminary, I wasn't even cautiously optimistic. I was pessimistic about that idea, you know, and you know, with some legitimacy and stuff like that, you see people all the time that go out and say, God told me to do this, God told me to do that. And, you know, I had studied sociology of religion, psychology of religion. And of course, you know, I was also somewhat of like a doubter and a seeker and stuff like that a lot in my early, you know, 18, 19 through my early 20s. And so when I came here and people started talking about like, God spoke to me, or God told me, this is what they regularly would say, is God's telling me this. And for the first several years that I lived in Wilmore, I would kind of shake my head and be like, you know, God doesn't speak that way, you know. Maybe God doesn't speak at all. And that changed in my life in just some really, you know, there was some life stuff that happened in my life that was major. And it was the first time I ever really felt 100% confident that God was speaking to me.
Wow.
And in fact, I remember like there was a point in a crisis of faith where I said, listen, God, like, you know, I need you to show yourself to me in a way that I can't rationalize on the one hand, and I can't say good people are just doing good things on the other hand. I need you to do something that shows me that you care, that you're provident, that you love, right? And he did. And it was like 6 months later he did. Yeah. And it was, for me, it was a game changer. So I still come with some suspicion anytime somebody says God's telling me to do this, because, you know, and I think that's healthy sometimes. But for me, that has changed over time to God really does give direction. And he does so in different ways. Sometimes it can be very explicit, so much as like mugs, right? And that just for me just felt like there was a guidance that was that, you know, area. And I don't know where this is going to lead to. I mean, that's the thing. Like mugs may be a step in a completely different direction. That eventually 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years down the line, you know, there will be this series of connections that goes all the way back to that word mugs. You know, like this started it, and the ball can roll wherever.
Yeah, it's cool how that happens.
Yeah.
And you don't see it necessarily at the time until you are, like you said, looking back.
Yeah, looking back in reflection. And I think most of us could probably do that at some point later on in our lives, where we look back and we see how, you know, we might have thought God was just being this explicit, this simple about something, but failing to really account for the fact that God's ways of weaving the ins and the outs and the turns and the twists and all that kind of stuff are things that we could just never put together on our own, you know.
So how does God speak to you now then? Because I'm curious because he speaks to everybody differently. Yeah. Oh,
man. Well, God knows that I'm a cautiously optimistic person when it comes to that.
Aren't we really glad?
Yeah, and that's good. I mean, that's one of the beautiful things I think about God is that he knows our personalities, right? And it's not something we do really well. I think sometimes we think that Christians should be this kind of personality, you know, be open to this, be open to this, be open to that, you know, and we kind of cookie cutter that sometimes, and like, we don't leave room for the fact that there's different personalities and God might speak to people in a different way. Some people are very much more heady, intellectual-ish kind of people. I'm a little bit more on that, my wife says I'm a 4 with a 5 wing.
Okay, so the Enneagram,
so I am one of those people. I will process emotionally, and then I will rationalize it and pick and choose and figure out if it, makes any sense at all.
What's your wife on the Enneagram?
Oh, she thinks she's a 9. I don't really know, but I'm skeptical of the Enneagram too. But that's a very 4 thing to do.
Right? My husband is a 4.
I used to think the Enneagram is cool.
Until everybody started
everybody thinks it's cool, and now I'm questioning it.
I'm a 6 on the Enneagram, so.
There you go. And so... Supposedly, theoretically. And, but, that's the fact. Like, we recognize there's various different personalities, and just like we would approach everybody else in a different way, depending on what their personality is, I think God speaks to us in different ways, too. Yeah. And some people, it is going to be more explicit. It is going to be more directional. It may be, for a lack of a better term, it may be more simple, And other people, like God may take years to communicate the message.
Right.
It may take a lifetime to communicate the message sometimes for some people. And that's just my own experience. Like, because I think I was jokingly voted in high school most likely to become an atheist. And I'm not. And I'm grateful for that because God spoke to me in the way that I needed him to speak to me. And, and if we're open to that, the fact that can happen.
Yeah.
Because I could have totally taken that life experience and said, I'm going to try and rationalize this away, or I'm going to try and make it up to coincidence or good people being good people or chance or whatever. But I think God does give everybody at least several moments throughout their life, I think, where he's going to speak to them in a way that they have to make a choice, whether they're going to accept it as a message from God, or whether they're going to find a way to wiggle out of that. So that's just some of my experience. So mugs, that's not something I would necessarily say was a big message, but I don't know what's a big message and what's a small message in the grand scheme of things.
Who are we to judge?
Who are we to judge? So.
Yeah. So tell me more about your mugs. How do you make them yourself? Like, how does that whole process work?
So we do make them ourselves. I've done several of our designs as well. I know you guys have had Winfield Bevins on the podcast.
Yes.
And he's a good friend, and he actually probably about 2 months after we started, we had a meeting at a coffee shop, ironically, and he said, well, why don't I draw up a couple and just, a couple designs. He said, I'm a decent caricaturist, and he said, let me draw up a couple designs and, just freebies and throw them your way. And so he did a Tolkien, and he did a Lewis, and he did a John Wesley for us. And
cool.
That really launched us into what we're doing now. And us and Winfield have a really great relationship. In fact, I just communicated with him today, and he sent me a George MacDonald and a T.S. Eliot and a new Julian of Norwich. And so we're like...
Oh, I love her.
Yeah, and so we're kind of redoing that one. But, he's done a lot of them that are really, sell really well. Rowan Williams for the Anglicans. So, and we have a couple other artists that work for us, but they'll send stuff in, and then I kind of took on like learning how to do graphic design, things like that a little bit, and so I'll go in and clean them up, do some colorizing, getting them ready for basically print, and then we actually make the mugs in-house through a process.
Okay, so what does that process making the mugs? Because is it like throwing pottery? Like what?
No, it's not.
Okay, yeah.
This is why I'm always surprised that this thing took off, because I'm like, we'll go to craft fairs and we'll sit next to a potter's booth and somebody's got these really great little, pottery stuff. And I'm like, I know this took you a total of like 20 hours to complete this one design. This thing took us 5 minutes. It's basic printing like you would get like on a T-shirt or stuff like that. We just happen to do it on mugs.
That's cool.
So it's pretty cool. It's called sublimation printing, and it really launched us into what we're doing. So that's kind of the process. So they send us stuff. I work on it, design it. Sometimes I'll design something myself,
cool.
and then we get it ready for print. We print it, bake it, and then bring it out. So
that's awesome. And so you make your own coffee too, obviously.
Yeah. So like I said, we were making mugs, and it was like, why not put the thing into the mug? And so
right,
it
like
just
have
became
something to put in it. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, one of my good friends, some people here may remember him. Some people listening to the podcast know people locally do. Jeremy Spainhauer, who's also a grad of the seminary. I think he's actually a PhD student now, but he ran a little coffee roasting company here called Kifu. And I did some just like work with him and just learning what that looks like, how to roast coffee, what you're looking for, what kind of beans you're looking for, suppliers, all that kind of jazz. And so I just recently told him, like, thank you for laying the fodder down for artisan coffee in Wilmore, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because years ago, I don't think this would have worked. I don't know that we would have had a space for something like this to happen in Wilmore.
Mm-hmm.
Either that or it would have been extremely challenging. But he was really good about just kind of laying some of the groundwork so people started to really appreciate good craft, locally roasted coffee. And then when they moved to Washington, we immediately like stepped in and started doing that, like barely skipped a beat, in doing that. And so it's been really great to watch like a place like Wilmore really change. Like we have people that come in all the time that are like, we used to drink this stuff over here, and now it's terrible.
Right.
and they'll only drink, Drinklings or, and I mean, in the grand scheme of things, if you're moving or you're somewhere else, like just artisan coffee that's helping out small business people, it's better for farmers, across the globe, things like that, rather than the big chains, where you get all sorts of like, it's not fair trade, it's not direct trade.
Yeah, all your coffee is fair trade, right?
Yeah, all of our coffee is fair trade or direct trade.
Okay. Now, explain the difference? I'm not sure.
Yeah, so fair trade really kind of took off during like the mid 90s, early 2000s, and basically its concern with fair trade was, making sure that farmers globally are gonna get paid fair wages. One of the difficult things here in the U.S. is when we're importing stuff, we're not always asking the right questions about where did this come from.
Okay.
Because we don't connect the faces with it. We don't connect the names with it. And most people when they brew a pot of coffee in the morning aren't thinking like, what are the names of the people that grew this?
No.
What are their stories? Do they have kids? Were their kids? All that kind of stuff. And when we import so much, we're kind of blinded to the conditions of it. And I tell people, listen, the cup of coffee that you're drinking took about 3 years to make,
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah. I mean, by the time you plant the tree and you grow the tree and stuff like that, it ends up being a 3 to 4 year process to go from seed to cup. And so there's just a lot of stories that are there. There's a lot of names that are there and faces that are there. And I think it's incumbent upon Christians in particular to spend time reflecting when we are dealing with imports and we are dealing with things that are coming from across the country, what the conditions are that create that, right?
Yeah.
Because they are still our neighbors. And if we are blinded to what conditions are, I mean, I think, I don't remember the name of the book. I think it was God in a Brothel. I don't remember the name of the author, though. And he talked about how most Americans own something in their homes that is the result of human trafficking. The problem is we don't know what it is.
Right.
And I think most of us, if we knew what it was, we'd immediately, cast it aside and get rid of it and not buy from, whatever that supplier is. We just don't know what that is. And we even have human trafficking in the U.S. and things like that, child labor. But that stuff happens a lot overseas. So, for example, one of our favorite coffees, whenever we can get it, we try and get it in. It's usually a Sumatran or a Colombian woman-produced coffee.
Oh, yes.
And women-produced coffee, I mean, you can kind of make the connections immediately. It's always fair trade, number one. But number two, the intent of that is to, in different societies, it's to kind of protect women from conditions that could potentially be exploitive, or abusive, or trafficking, or any, anything along those lines. And so by giving these women jobs and they're doing the harvesting, they're doing the depulping, they're doing all that kind of stuff, the preparation for the coffee prior to export, it's keeping them and maybe their families and maybe their kids out of precarious positions.
Yes, for sure.
And so all of that is to say, like, that's what fair trade's intent is to do, is to say we want to give people fair wages to live on. It has to be a livable wage. And so there's, I don't remember the exact number, but it's like close to $1.92 a pound or something like that is going to immediately go to those farmers.
Right.
So the distinction between fair trade and direct trade, though, is that fair trade doesn't take into account for certain geographical, economic, social variables.
Okay.
And so fair trade in a particular country may end up being fair for this country that maybe has like $1 to whatever their currency is, almost equivalent there. But there may be other countries in which our dollar is not worth the same as theirs, or they have other economic things and things like that are stripping them of financial benefits or whatever. And you see it happen a lot, in fact, with fair trade, that kind of your richer countries get the fair trade deals.
Right.
Your more poverty-stricken areas can't afford to purchase fair trade certification. And so when people buy fair trade and say we're not going to buy not fair trade, sometimes you're actually doing harm to those farmers and those farmers' families that because of poverty, because of social conditions, they can't afford the certification for fair trade. So that's the point about direct trade, is direct trade puts you in contact with the actual farm itself. And the people of the farm itself, rather than working through middlemen and stuff like that. You get to sit down and ask questions and say, what are your needs? What do and you get to arrange and negotiate a price that works for everybody. And so that's the direct trade is slowly becoming more of like the go-to in the coffee industry.
That's awesome.
Where fair trade just has problems to it.
Okay.
But I will say at the end of the day, it's better to buy fair trade than not fair trade.
For
most
sure.
of the time.
For sure. How do you work out these deals directly with farmers? Because I know you're doing direct trade.
So we are moving in that direction. We have been fair trade for a long time. We do have one direct trade supplier that we buy from. Now we do buy from that. It's a Brazilian farm, and we know all about them, stuff like that, what their working conditions are, things like that. Right now we can't import hundreds of thousands of pounds of coffee on a ship. So right now we're actually working with a partner who actually sets up the direct trade contract with them, and then we're buying off the ship, through that contract.
That's awesome.
Eventually, and this is in a kind of our 1 to 2 year plan, hopefully by 2020, what year is it?
2019,
right? so by 2020 will be the year that we're kind of actually spending more of our time focusing on the preparation work. And by 2021, our plan, and that can change, but our plan is to actually be on the ground in different countries working on some of these contracts.
Wow.
And setting up farms. So you have to start somewhere, and working with a partner who understands direct trade, has good connections with the farm, stuff like that, and can vouch for those conditions is kind of that first step. And then take a whole year and do some preparation work and work with building partners. And that's one of the cool things right now, and being in a place like Wilmore, we have so many people that come from different countries and or are going to different countries that we actually have some scouts for us in a weird kind of non-official
awesome.
way.
Yeah.
People that are going overseas that have said, as I'm doing this, I'm going to want to connect you with the people that I meet over there. And so those are coming along the way, and we've started to have those conversations, but that is in the kind of the future to grow the direct trade.
That's awesome. Well, when this podcast releases, it'll release in spring 2020, so it won't be that far away from when you guys are going to be doing this. Yeah. So we're excited about that, and we hope that there's some other things. We would love, we're kind of in the early
talks as well about potentially putting together like a class on coffee, and it would be an interdisciplinary thing where we can talk about the economics, the ethics, the agriculturalism. It's called agronomy when it relates to coffee. You talk about sociological stuff, and then potentially some mission stuff. That's important there too. And so my dream really by 2021 is not only to be going overseas and setting up some of these contracts, but be taking a team of students or people that are interested in that kind of stuff and
I want to go.
Yeah, and taking them overseas and maybe doing some justice work and some building and getting hands-on training. If people need storehouses built, we work with them to do that, right? If you need help, extra hands in harvesting, we help out with that kind of stuff.
That would be amazing.
So that's my hope, is to really say like we will turn this into just being we're a simple coffee shop that makes mugs right now.
Right.
But we are putting the pieces together to say like our mission can be expanded into intercultural environments, into those relationships, things like that. And so that's kind of where we're in the early stages of that.
That's awesome. I had no idea, but that's wonderful.
So, but like I said, those are all plans. So, things can
but
change.
that's still, you have to start with plans.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So you roast the coffee yourself, right?
Yep. Yeah. And I've trained a couple other folks to kind of help along with those lines.
Yeah.
But we are small batch artisan roasted stuff.
Okay.
So
tell me about roasting, because you do different blends. How does that? I don't know anything, so tell me about it.
So if you've never seen like coffee in its original state, it's interesting to do. Most people don't recognize that coffee is actually the seed of a fruit. And so it's weird to think about that. Like coffee comes from an actual cherry, and grows on a tree. And so it's pulled off the tree, it's harvested, it's depulped, so you pull that out of there. In fact, you can take like the little cherries and make tea out of them and stuff. So it's kind of cool. Yeah. But then, over a process of weeks to months, the coffee actually ends up drying out over time. Sumatras tend not to kind of be that way, oftentimes, which is why it's kind of a very different kind of cup. But most coffees are dried out for an extended period of time, then they're bagged, then they're shipped, and we'll bring in, I don't know, 1,500, 2,000, 3,000 pounds of raw coffee beans into our shop, and then
at one time.
Wow. And we will. Then we roast according to specifications, recipes, things like that. So it takes about 9 to 10 minutes. Anybody can do roasting, and that's the crazy thing. Like back before like World War II, there's two things that people did. I'm sure there's more, but there's two things that I've been impressed on that people did that we've kind of given up to convenience. Number one, people baked their own bread. They didn't buy the sliced bread, stuff like that. They made their own bread at home. Number two, people actually roasted their own coffee at home.
Wow, I didn't know that.
And so that's a cool thing too, is we've seen more people that are interested in kind of saying like, I'd like to do this at home. And it ends up being cheaper for a lot of people and things like that, to do that. And you get good quality control, experimentation, all that kind of jazz. But that, anybody can learn it. And just because, some place might have like a big corporate, sign or something like that, I'm not naming anybody out, but it doesn't mean that anything's actually any better than a lot of the local stuff. So,
right.
A lot of times you see the craftiness, the art that goes into locally produced stuff over against big market stuff or big corporate stuff. And so we really appreciate the way that we do roasting. We're not doing 200 pounds an hour. We're doing 9 pounds at a time. Mm-hmm. So it's always going to be fresh. It's always going to be small batch roasted. It's always going to have somebody paying attention to the detail of it. And so that's the cool thing, and you just get to experiment with different flavors, different variances. We've seen more people go from dark roasted, aficionados into light roasted aficionados over time, because they're recognizing like, well, this stuff over here, some of these places burn their coffee, and that gives it a uniform taste. But when you make it on like the lighter side, you get more flavor profiles, things like that. So
wow, I didn't know
people
that.
have kind of appreciated that.
Yeah.
So.
How did you learn how to roast coffee?
YouTube, YouTube, and a couple articles.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is the thing. Like, just like with baking bread, like you're gonna get a few like flat loaves through the process, but the more that you do it, the better you're gonna understand what's happening. The more things you're gonna learn to look out for, things like that. And you know, so but YouTube is definitely the start.
Don't we love it?
And I love following new roasters because they almost always burn their stuff, you know.
Like, how do you burn it? Because I remember, because you make the coffee for the podcast, and you called once and you were like, it's not going to be, I'm going to have it to you on a certain day because, like, I need a fire extinguisher or something like that. And I was like, oh my gracious.
Coffee is roasted upwards of usually between like 400 degrees and 465 degrees.
Okay, yeah, definitely need.
Now, our roaster ends up getting a lot hotter than that, so we actually work on a roaster that runs closer to 650 to 700 degrees.
Okay.
And that time, I hadn't experienced that before, so I was kind of in a little freak-out mode. But there's oils that come off of coffee. Most of us don't think about that either, but there's oils that come off of coffee. And I just hadn't changed my pipes out in the time that I was supposed to. And so more of the oils kind of caught in it. And so kind of burned through something, but it was not a big deal.
Yeah, I didn't think that it was. I was just curious about how the process worked. So
yeah, it's very, very hot stuff. And so, and that's the crazy thing is you can move, within 30 to 40 seconds, you can move from a light roasted cup into a burned cup, you know.
Whoa.
So that's one of those things that it's good to have that small batch, you know, personal attention, stuff like that, because once you know what to look for, you know, you can create a specific kind of cup, and not just, like I said, newbie roasters and so forth, they almost always burn it because they're not paying quite enough attention to the process.
Yeah. Where do you roast at?
We roast in Wilmore. We have a little shop that we started at 325 East Main Street in Wilmore. And
that's where like the Drinklings is.
And that's where like the Drinklings shop is.
Yeah.
So Drinklings Coffee and Mugs is our kind of our working name. This is called the Drinklings Roastery. Which is where we do all of our roasting, and we just got put a shop in front of us, and we're going with it.
Okay, cool.
But that's kind of, we do all the roasting there. We've done it in different places before, but that's kind of where we set up shop.
So like, is the roastery in Drinklings?
It is in the shop.
Okay.
So anybody can actually come and watch us do it. Oftentimes, if you're nice, and we like you, you can come back behind the counter and watch us. You know.
Am I nice? Can I come?
Yes,
and
you
watch?
can come
okay.
watch. We're actually working on a new build out, so we're going to actually be able to bring it out. So it will be more of a public thing. You know, right now it's just kind of behind the counter and stuff, but we want to get more involved in the community and so forth. But anybody can come in and watch us do this and ask questions, and we can talk through it all. So
that's awesome. How do you see coffee as mission? Has that grown like from when you first started, or did you always kind of see it as a way to do good in the world?
Yeah. So when we initially started, for me, what's called social entrepreneurship has been a big factor in what we do. In fact, you know, it's just part of my convictions in life, vocation, so forth, is that if you're doing something, you should always be concerned about what social good it's doing, right? A lot of our social problems, economic problems, stuff like that kind of come down to, you know, just people not paying attention to the ways that their business might harm people, implicate other people, or just fail to contribute to the betterment of society in general. Right. So when we initially started, we weren't Coffee with a Mission because we weren't doing coffee for those first few months. But we wanted to leverage off some of our mugs and give to different social mission causes.
Okay.
I chose the term social mission rather than social justice because that's often plagued with some controversy. I also chose the notion of social mission because I think I think it translates well in the broader culture. If you get deeper into our stuff, you realize when we're talking about social mission, we're talking about kingdom mission,
Gotcha.
kingdom work.
Yeah.
That just most people don't know what that means.
Right. Yeah. So tell us what you mean by social mission.
Yeah.
Like versus social justice. Like you don't have to get into all that, but what do you mean by social?
Yeah.
mission?
I mean, social mission, like I said, it's going back to asking more kingdom of God kind of questions, rather than just picking a particular issue and saying we're going to stand for this issue. We're going to fight for this issue. My background, for example, aside from theology, is social work, and you see social justice all over social work, and you see it in all sorts of different faith traditions, non-faith traditions. You see it as, in political and partisan camps. You see it, attached to a lot of stuff, and a lot of the time that can be really good, but it doesn't make the connection into like kingdom work, right? Like, why are you doing this?
Okay.
Social justice, for example, can be very humanistically driven.
Okay.
And so, I think we've seen throughout history, like wherever humanism might attach its point of progress or its ideals or anything like that, social justice aims at that. Right. It says this is the human ideal. This is the progress. We're gonna take these issues and we're gonna stand for them, and oftentimes that works out great, and that's really necessary. I mean, you talk about civil rights, women's suffrage, so forth. But there's other things like, we contributed, I think close to $1,000 to crisis pregnancy centers that were local. Now, oftentimes that might be seen, depending on your partisan camp and your personal views and where the culture stands on something, it's not going to be seen as a social justice thing. Oftentimes it will be seen as a non-social justice thing, right? Like we're actually, and we chose that one very specifically and very carefully because for me, I have pretty significant criticisms of the way that we've kind of partisaned out this issue in particular. And it's an issue that is also very personal for me in my own life. But, just through a number of connections and a number of people that I'm very close to. But for us, it was like, that's a kingdom thing. It's not a social justice thing. It's not holding up a humanistic ideal or anything like that. Social mission is about mission. It's about accomplishing something with an end goal, right? And that end goal is biblical. It's Christian, it stands for those ideals and against humanistic ideals or whatever we think is, fanciful at the time. Yeah. So that all of that to say we're not usually opponents of social justice. We've just realized, usually the culture and Christianity oftentimes take similar concepts, but we parse them out a little bit different. And for us, we just want to parse that out. So we've done a decent amount in that area, not as much as I would like to, because we started off, like a lot of companies do, with a percentage of profits go towards such and such.
Right.
One of the challenges we're facing is that as moving from just being a coffee roaster to a shop comes a whole lot of other dynamics that are there, and very expensive dynamics.
For sure.
And we've been realizing, like, we talk about social mission, but because of the way that, like the expenses and revenue streams, especially in a small town and things like that sometimes the profits can be fleeting, in this kind of high turnover world where you're reliant upon like people coming in, people, coming back again and so forth. And so we are actually in a position of re-strategizing what that means. Okay. I think we've landed somewhere between like, moving into revenue, giving away portions of our revenue and just needing to kind of like step out in faith and say like we're giving ahead of it, right? We're not waiting until everything's in the bucket and we get a little bit reaped over. For us now, it's like we're stepping out on some faith that we're going to be giving away some profits towards particular ends, and really trusting that like God's going to bless that ahead of time. And for me, that's a challenging thing. It's a scary thing.
Yeah, because you're a business owner with the faith,
Yeah. Yeah, it is a little bit like giving out of your, giving 10% of your tithe without knowing like this isn't going to really hurt you later.
Right. Most of us tithe after we get our paycheck.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And this for us, there's just the strong conviction that, profits may be in this kind of world, especially in startup worlds, and we are kind of at a new startup phase with all of this. Is that profits may be fleeting for 3 to 5 years.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean we hold off on our mission for the next 3 to 5 years. We are called to do this now, and we need to do it with whatever capability and means that we have now, rather than waiting for those means to be available later.
That's a good word for all of us, whether we're starting a business or
wherever. It's terrifying, trust me.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But that's just, man, there's just been this conviction over the past week as we've gone through like rewriting business plans and stuff like that, and rewriting missions and goals and values and so forth. And I think the other part of that has switched for us is, we've given to different global causes. We've given to certain causes have been our big thing. So we've given to like crisis pregnancy centers. We've given to an addiction recovery center. We gave to a human trafficking center. We've worked with, I don't know if you've had Jacob Gwat on your
No, I haven't, but we
before.
do Voices, because I talked to you for Voices before, and he's been on our Voices.
Yeah, and so
page.
we've given through African Sunrise Ministries to building some schools. We've done some just some other stuff through maybe like World Vision and so forth. But for us, we've also started to see a shift into say like, and this a lot comes from like my time at the seminary, right? Is that we're here and we often get told to go out across the world and change things in different places. And I think one of the things that some students, grads, especially those who stay around, recognizing is that like our mission should be starting here. Like if you walk out your front door and your focus is like 10 hours that way or in a completely different country that way, but you're not looking at the neighbor that actually legitimately lives right next to you, like you might be missing something.
Right, like Jerusalem, we were told to start in Jerusalem first and then branch out,
And so we don't fully know what this looks like yet, but because it's just a matter of like figuring out some of the details, but I mentioned a little bit of my own journey a while ago and kind of getting into a place where, I was struggling with faith and so forth. We had tragedy happen in our family, and we had this church down the street, and you're familiar with the Southland, and they have a program that they run called the Dollar Club. And with that, they look outside their immediate periphery and say, where are the people that are hurting, and how can we help? And so they raise money and they go out and help in very practical ways. That is the direction that we're actually now taking our company. And for 9 years, since me and my family were the recipients of the Dollar Club, I've had that on my heart where God has not letting me shaken. Like this happened to you. It really saved your life. And in a lot of ways, it also helped save my faith. And I'm supposed to not just move on from that, like I'm supposed to do something with that. And I've always thought this would be really cool to see not just like Southland do this, but lots of other churches do that, and watch businesses do that. If a business was able to give away, not all are, most probably aren't, but if a business is able to give away money towards the practical needs of its community, like how would we change? If we can go out and buy a gas card for somebody, like how much is that going to change? If we can go out and pay rent for somebody, how much is that going to change in the scope of the kingdom? And so, like I said, we're shifting in this process. We kind of are doing this interview at a different time, but we're shifting more in that direction from saying we're not going to be looking overseas right now. Maybe we'll go back there. That is a fair trade, direct trade. Like that's where we are doing that in that way. But as a small town coffee shop, as a small town roaster, and as small town people who have pitched their lives here, like our heart is for our community, and saying like that social mission can begin here.
For sure.
So we're excited. I mean, maybe whenever this podcast gets released, like we'll have a couple stories to tell about that. But we'll be beginning that actually this month, and looking what specifically at the end of November, at the end of December, how we are, contributing towards our little town of Wilmore.
That's beautiful. I love that. Like, yeah, because I've been thinking about that too. Like, because like giving overseas is great, but I'm like, there are people who live right next to me.
Yeah.
And what am I doing about them? Because they're my literal neighbors,
Right.
So.
Yeah, Wilmore's an interesting place, and I think a lot of small towns are like this in that, I worked for a year at the Community Service Center when I was doing my social work internship, and I didn't realize how much poverty our area has. And that may have been shielded a little bit because I was a grad student and fairly middle class, and lived in a community. People here might know Calais and so forth. We lived there, and we do have these invisible gates, not just here, but most of us do in our lives, where we have these invisible gates that become barriers to us seeing over the, for lack of a better term, over the railroad tracks, right? Here, that's actually literal, seeing over the railroad tracks. And for us, that's just become a big conviction, is like, we are on one side of the railroad tracks. Drinklings is on one side of the railroad tracks. But we hear that train go every single day. We can look out our window, we can see the railroad tracks. And every single day, we got to cross over those railroad tracks to get back to our home. Like, that's our mission first. That's whatever, if the church is changing a little bit, and we're thinking in terms of business as mission, and mission as business, and church, engagement in the marketplace, like businesses that have that calling and that conviction to be, I'm putting quotation marks in church, right? To be actively the church. This is their parish then too. And that's just what we've been convinced of, is like, this is our parish. Like, this is our parish.
Yeah.
And so we really want that here. So
yeah, you're engaging in redemptive living now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hopefully so.
Yeah. Hopefully. Yeah. Yeah.
So
that's awesome. What advice would you give to someone who's wanting to, I guess, for lack of a better term, use their life for good and like through business?
Well, I think one of those things is just kind of what we talked about. Like, this has been a challenge, but realizing, like, God said mugs years ago. I didn't know what that meant, and it's required a lot of adaptation, and just continual listening and challenging and stuff like that. And so we are kind of in that phase of readapting, instead of saying, like, no, this is putting my stick in the ground and this is what God called me to do and I'm not moving from here.
Right.
Like God, like, we may stop. I don't know what we'll do, but like mugs 30 years from now, that whole continuity of strings may be something completely different. So I think Christian entrepreneurs, when God's giving us an idea to do something, like, we have to be willing to follow him where he's going to go with that. And as I say this enough, that Drinklings didn't plan on a coffee shop. We weren't supposed to have a coffee shop in that sense, right? Like, this wasn't the original plan. It wasn't we were just a coffee roaster who did mugs.
Yeah, you weren't planning
on
a brick and mortar.
And we had an online store.
Yeah.
That happened, and it just happened in a very kind of God-like way. Like, we feel like we're supposed to go down there. We scoped out the town, came back. A day later, somebody called us and said, I'm buying this building. We'd like to have you guys in here. And
Wow.
it was like that. Right after we come back and said that there's no place to go.
Wow.
In Wilmore. So there's kind of that God stuff there. But God may call us out of this, and so I'm having to recognize, like, we are here for a season. God may change that at some point, and I think it's important for Christians and businesses to not get so hung up on whatever they're doing now that it stops them from seeing the ways that God might use them or change things later. Because I think God does call things into living, but he also does call things into dying too, and changing.
Yeah, there's a season for everything. Yeah.
There's a season for everything. And so we have to recognize when God is opening a season and when he's closing a season. The other part of that is, like, I think it's important for followers of Jesus to I think the social entrepreneurship idea is really important to look at.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are looking at business, or you're looking at entrepreneurship, to really be asking those questions. How does this not just benefit me? Because the reality is, money is enticing, even for Christians.
Yeah.
Money is enticing.
We all have bills.
Start to get it.
Yeah.
We all have bills and so forth. And I think I really, really continually believe that when Jesus said, like, it's hard for a rich man to get into the kingdom of heaven, like, he wasn't just giving us a euphemism, like, it is really hard once we start saying, like, and it's not just money. I mean, money can be metaphorical there for success, for reputation, for power, for whatever. And I often think, like, we get a lot of celebrity Christians, but I'm oftentimes think, like, hey, nobody's approaching you at the airport saying you're so and so. Like, you are nobody to most of the world, and you may be successful in your own little venture, in your own little neck of the woods, but you are still nobody in the rest of the world. You are somebody in the kingdom of God, but don't get so hung up on yourself that you're not willing to follow God where He's leading.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. When did you guys open up your storefront?
In late March of 2019, so just a few months ago.
Oh, wow. It feels like you guys have been there forever in a good way. Like, you're just part of the scene in Wilmore.
Yeah, it's only been 7 months. So we're still actually, that's what I said, like, rewriting the business plan, all that kind of stuff. Because just going from being a coffee roaster and mug producer with an online storefront to an actual storefront where we have employees, staff, hours, whatever, it's just big change. So, with that change is coming, like, some change in our mission stuff that we're really excited about.
Yeah. Yeah, you alluded to it a minute ago when we were talking, but how you even got into the space, because you said this wasn't supposed to happen.
Yeah.
So how did it happen?
So anybody that's familiar with Wilmore for more than a year probably remembers there's a little Mexican restaurant down there called Jose's.
Oh, yes.
Before that, if anybody's listening, of course there was a pizzeria in there. There was a little cafe that was in there. It was really cool with some of the deconstruction of the place to kind of see just some layers of history and stuff like that. And that goes into the long view of things too, is that eventually somebody else is going to buy our place and they're going to see, like, this used to be a coffee joint. There's chaff in the wall, but it was a Mexican restaurant. Jose was a great friend of ours, and he was just such a minister to
he was
anybody that went down there. Just for tacos or quesadillas or something like that.
It was good food.
It was good, it was really good food. But he did that out of conviction and a following. He didn't do it because he was making bukus of money. In fact, I know that he wasn't. And he passed away from cancer about a year ago this time, maybe a little bit less than that. And for us, this is a huge honor because we actually started some of the initial conversations about Drinklings in Jose's, never knowing that we were going to be back there.
Wow.
And living in the space. And there's also some very personal connections with me too that I love about the space too. Some just long history stuff, and that's a great thing about this space, is that spaces do mean something. And God puts spaces in our life for reasons, and I think they can be confirming. And so for me, like, the personal connection that I have there historically, and then some of the initial conversations about Drinklings being there, and just the friendship with Jose and feeling like knowing him rather than just some outsider who didn't know him and just took over the building or anything like that. For us, it's like an honor because I remember Jose so well. Those conversations and I worked on like his going away party and stuff like that before we even knew there was going to be a Drinklings there, and just to see him blessed through that time was awesome.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's really cool.
So spaces are good. God gives us spaces, and this is God's given us this for a time. We want to use it well, and hopefully we are.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's a great place to visit. So how can people connect with you?
So of course, if you live in Wilmore, just, anybody can kind of walk down the street and hang out with us there. We do have, we have Facebook.com or Facebook.com/Drinklings. We have an Instagram account, Drinklings Coffee. I'm not big on social media personally, so that's about the extent of our social media activity. But if people shoot a message over, we'll catch them. We do have a website, Drinklings.coffee, www.drinklings.coffee, and they can check us out there.
Right. And we'll link to all of that in the show notes too, so people will be able to find you.
And we love to hear from people, so shoot a message or anything like that. And so.
What's your favorite blend of coffee?
Oh man, the ones that we do. That's a really hard question. Our most popular is our Oxford blend.
Okay.
That is hands down our most popular in the shop. I'm probably going to say that that's also my favorite as well.
Okay.
It is our house coffee for a reason.
Okay.
We did just come out another homage to the Inklings. The Oxford blend, homage to Oxford. C.S. Lewis was a professor at Cambridge for a while, and so we just did come out with a Cambridge blend as well. So we got these little nerd things too.
Yeah.
But I think the Oxford's probably the better of all of them.
All right. So have you always liked coffee?
I had, well, not as a baby.
But like when you were 5, you started drinking coffee?
I remember I had my first cappuccino at 10, and I thought it was disgusting. And it was at Disney World, ironically. So it might have not really been like a good cappuccino either. I think it was like off of a cart somewhere. I started really getting into coffee at like 15 or 16. And of course, college came,
And then it was a necessity.
Yeah. I mean, I'll be honest, like ever since starting this, I've been far more into coffee than I ever was before.
Okay.
I mean, I was really into coffee and I would go through a pot a day, myself. But, learning the art of it has been something that this has kind of pushed me into and getting to know really well. And so I'm learning like crazy too, through it all,
Yeah.
So it's a joke in the roasting or coffee shop community that if you can always tell who owns a coffee shop by going in their kitchen and seeing what kind of coffee stuff they have, because coffee shop owners, we don't have an auto drip, we have a Chemex, a French press, a manual espresso, thing. It's like obviously we own a coffee shop in our kitchen.
Right.
So.
Right. Yeah. Tell me about the Thrive blend. Like, what is that?
Yeah.
Like?
So we one of the things we love about this community is just being able to work with the schools that are here and some of the churches and so forth. And so, when you guys kind of approached us about doing a coffee, we know it's not going to be a big turnover kind of thing. And I think that's part of the awesome thing about small batch artisan roasted and the local coffee scene is we can do some experiments on blends, whereas like big coffee roasters, that might be in big cities and stuff like that, they're gonna want a guarantee. Like I remember when we were starting, because we thought for a while about not doing our own coffee but just outsourcing it. We talked to a company that said, well, if you can guarantee us $2,000 a month in revenue, we'll be glad to give you like a custom blend. And we were like, well, we can't promise $2,000 a month in revenue. And that's, I get where they're coming from, but for us, it's like the Asbury and Asbury Seminary have been so formational in us that for us, it's like, you know what, we would love to like do some custom stuff. And so we have the Thrive blend for you guys. We do another one for the ESJ school. That's kind of a custom blend. We do have an Asbury blend that we do locally, and we sell a lot of that like through the university and so forth. So we really like doing the experimental kind of stuff with that, and
so
the Thrive blend it's a specific bean that we kind of prototyped. On a particular roast, and we just thought like we were going to reserve this one for you guys. So we hope you guys do like it.
Yeah,
and
it's
your
awesome.
guests like it. And
yeah,
so forth.
It's awesome. I've heard nothing but good, like I said.
That's good.
Yeah,
that's good.
Yeah.
It's just it's one of our ways of like just kind of giving back as an appreciation.
Yeah.
Like, we'd love to do that.
Yeah.
For people,
Yeah.
for churches, for organizations. So.
Yeah. And it's really great to have a place that you can purchase something, know where it came from, and do good in the world through what you're buying. Because we're going to buy coffee anyway. Right. But it's nice to do good with our purchase. So.
Yeah, and that's the big overarching thing. I mean, when you talk about social entrepreneurship, is what good are you doing? And I think that means not just from coffee. I mean, coffee's simple, fair trade chocolate, fair trade coffee. Those are the things that people attach to trading. But everything that we do, the shoes that you're wearing, the shirt and the